my pleasure to introduce Nicole Hemming-Schroeder. Dr. Hemming-Schroeder is somebody I've known a long time because it was in 2009 when I was a second-year assistant professor with a newborn and a 2-year-old that Nicole reached out and said, hey, I want to do a senior thesis, and then you transferred to the AOS program, and I really like the stuff that you're doing on carbon cycle. And so Nicole was the third ever undergrad to work in my lab many years ago, and we had a real fun. She worked with a PhD student of mine on wetland carbon modeling. Obviously, that's not what she does today, but there's a lot of relations in terms of thinking about land atmosphere science that maybe has some heritage from that. Not only did she work on that for her senior thesis, but she actually helped co-author that publication with the student Ben Salmon, and the paper's now been cited like 60, 70 times already, which is pretty cool. And a lot of it was based on some of the work that Nicole did in evaluating the wetland models we had there. But after she left AOS, she switched gears for a bit and was a middle and high school teacher in 3 different locations in Milwaukee and in Sun Prairie in California. And she told me earlier today that a lot of that was teaching algebra and geometry, and as much as that we tend to think of ourselves as doing much higher math, in fact, a lot of that comes into handy more than we tend to think it does in the day-to-day stuff we do as scientists, right? And so, in many ways, an opportunity to really sharpen your skills there. But after a while, decided to work. She started getting a master's degree while she was still teaching at night, and then in applied math, and then switched over to do a PhD at UC Irvine with co-advised by Jim Randerson and with Steve Allison. And finished her PhD not that long ago, last year.
Yeah,
yep, last year. And has now transitioned into a research associate position at the University of Colorado in series of the Earth Lab at Jennifer Balch, where she's working on a few topics related to wildfire, and then so we presented today a little bit about her PhD work that she's done on tree mortality in the Sierra Nevada. And so I think I got everything. But so I was super excited when I had caught up again with Nicole at my AG lab reunion dinner and said if she had some interest in presenting some of her work out here. And so I'm very gracious to the CPEP program for helping make that happen. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nicole. The title is Mapping and Modeling Individual Tree Mortality After 2012-2016 California Drought.
Thank you, Oliver, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Awesome. So I'm going to present on my dissertation work primarily on mapping and modeling individual tree mortality after the California drought from 2012 to 2016. So from 2012 to 2016, an estimated 129 million trees died in California. And the reason for that is that there was this very severe drought, and this figure here shows the deep drying from 2012 to 2015 in particular, which was particularly severe in the southern Sierra Nevada, and that's also where our study sites are. They coincide with the neon sites in California, so Fruit Saddle and Lower Tea Kettle. And so just some background, why do trees die during a drought? One reason is for hydraulic failure. Another is bark beetle attack, which is particularly relevant in this study. And this is particularly true in California for ponderosa pines and sugar pines. And then wildfire exacerbated by dry and water-stressed fuels. So the first aim that I'm going to discuss today is just addressing how many of the trees died during the drought at the scale of individual trees, and then to what extent we can model mortality risk at that individual scale, and then a project where we wanted to link that individual tree data set, which is really over a relatively small area, to the Landsat satellite record. So for AIM 1, we've got our 2 study sites, and so it's at much lower elevation for Soap Root Saddle, and then lower Tea Kettle is at higher elevation. And then they're in the southern Sierra Nevada, and there are 5 flight campaigns that collected LiDAR and spectral reflectance data for 2013, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2021. So the drought went from 2012 to 2016, so it doesn't perfectly correspond. But in 2017, you can see quite a bit of tree mortality. That was probably there in 2016. And 2013 is a relatively good baseline for looking at the change from the drought. And so we have these very high resolution LiDAR point clouds from the NEON program. It's publicly available data. And we use those along with hyperspectral reflectance data. And while hyperspectral reflectance data is available for around 420 bands over the site, we really looked at a few specific vegetation indices just for this study. But there's a lot of potential there for other investigations. And the underlying thought process here is that for example, unhealthy plants reflect much more red light than healthy plants, and then there's other differences like that that you can leverage through the electromagnetic spectrum to look at things like water in leaves and things like that. So we tested a few vegetation indices that leverage these differences in reflectance from the different spectral bands. And so just for reference, we've got blue, green, red. We thought I'll talk about how we use some of these today, and near infrared, particularly for looking at NDVI. So for our method, we wanted to leverage existing R packages and open source software to segment the trees. And we wanted to be able to track them over time. So the first step that we took was to combine all the available LiDAR points to locate where the individual trees are. So if they are there in 2013 but have fallen by 2021, you can see that change. So you can see that there's a tree there and note it, and then see that it's gone later on. So the first step then is just to find those individual treetop locations. And then from 2013 through 2021, this is just an example of a group of trees. If that area experiences a lot of mortality, you can see the structural changes by year. And so if we locate them in 2013 and then can see the changes that occur. And so for each of those years, we drew polygons around the crown perimeters. And this is just a small sample of the area that we have those individual tree polygons for. And overall, we tracked over 1 million trees for all 5 years of data available, including the changes in their crown perimeters. So if I go back a slide here, if we have a polygon from 2013, you can see that it's gone by 2021 because when the algorithm to segment trees looks for that tree, it creates a polygon that's so small. We used a cutoff of under 1 square meter to count that tree as having fallen by then. So you can use both the spectral reflectance to look at changes in the tree health, but also those structural changes. And then we did do a labeled set of dead trees so that we could use that to train a very simple algorithm for classifying trees as dead or alive. And we hand labeled almost 9,000 individual trees using QGIS. So we just zoomed in on this regular grid of squares. and labeled each one that had its treetop location within the square as dead or alive. And so this is just an example of quite a few dead trees where you can tell by their orange needles, or some of them have lost their needles and started to have a gray signature. And when we're labeling them, you can also kind of flip back and forth from 2013 to 2017 to look at that change too, to help make a decision. And so then these are the trees then that are classified as dead or alive with our automated algorithm. So the trees that are outlined in the lighter yellow polygons are dead trees, whereas the trees with the blue polygons are classified as alive. And there's certainly some issues here and there, but overall it seems to pick up the overall signal that we were looking for. We did explore 5 different indices to classify the trees as dead or alive, and relative greenness turned out to be the best one. That could have a lot to do with that's essentially what we were looking at when we were hand labeling them as well. So some of the results I have for both relative greenness and NDVI, which is a little bit more separated from that, though the relative greenness and NDVI correlate. But we did explore some moisture indices just to see, but some of the flight campaigns might start early in the day and cover some regions when they're really moist, and then cover other ones when it's dried out, more at like solar noon. And so we think maybe some of those variations made it a little bit trickier to detect tree mortality that way, because there's some diurnal variance that is introduced just from the timing of the campaigns. But for relative greenness, we just did a grid search where we looked at the whole domain of relative greenness from 0 to 1 and crown fraction. So what fraction of the tree is below that threshold to try to classify them as dead or alive. And so we looked at every combination going up by 0.01 of the two, just to see where that accuracy was the highest and use that as our classifier. And so on the training data, it has 93% accuracy, and then that accuracy falls to 92% for our testing accuracy. So there's some trees that are not correctly classified, but in general, the trees that are labeled dead are estimated as dead, and the trees that are labeled alive are for the most part labeled as alive. So these diagonals where the boxes are accurate seem relatively consistent. And then this is just showing that you can get relatively similar results with NDVI as well. And it just falls off a bit when we get to the moisture indices. So a question that we had is that we were classifying more than 1 million trees, but we only labeled 8,885 of them. So we were really wondering, is that enough trees to train this classifier? And we did find that when we randomly arranged the trees and trained the classifier on increasing numbers of them, going up by, I believe, 100 in each set, that the overall accuracy converged relatively quickly. So using just these 2 metrics, this is about as good as we could get without introducing some other bit of information. So we do feel relatively sure that for the simple method, this was enough trees to get what we could out of it. Okay, so the end result here, so these are the individual tree mortality, but they're aggregated to the scale of the Landsat resolution. So they're just aggregated to 30 meter by 30 meter pixels. And so this is the mortality fraction within each pixel. And so this first one is the soap root saddle site. It's at a lower elevation compared with lower tea kettle. So despite the name, this is the higher elevation site. And it's really in this range that there was some previous literature by Hill et al. Where like a lot of these trees in this elevation range are kind of past their like climatic comfort zone, so climate change has really put them out of where they would normally be. And so not only are they dying, but there's a lot of questions we have about whether they would come back or not, or whether this might transition to shrubland. But in any case, these are lower elevation, they're warmer temperatures, more stressed, and there's about 50% tree mortality that we found here compared with more closer to 25% at the higher elevation site. And then when we look year by year, soap root saddle, that low elevation, more stressed site, really hits that 50% point at about 2017 and then just stays there. So it seems like the trees that are going to die from that stress are gone by then until there's an uptick within fire perimeters later on. So there were 2 fires in between these 2 time points, the creek fire and the blue fire, and those took out quite a few trees. Whereas at lower tea kettle, there seems to be sort of kind of like an inertia of tree mortality over those years from that stressor until it levels out by 2021. So just to take a closer look at tree mortality within the wildfire perimeters, I have soap root saddles, tree mortality, the change in tree mortality fraction between 2019 and 2021. So a lot of the tree mortality was in this region, so there's not a lot of changes between those years. However, a lot of the trees that were still alive are now gone between 2019 and 2021 because of the creek fire, which is outlined in black for 2020. And then later on, there was the blue fire in 2021, right before the imagery was done again with the LiDAR and the hyperspectral instrument from the airborne campaigns. And so this is a close-up of the blue fire, where you can still see quite a bit of ash and even the orange flame retardant, like to contain the fire on the ground. And so within the creek fire from 2020, only 35% of the trees were dead before, and then 82% after. Whereas with the 2021 fire, it jumps from 50% to 94% tree mortality between those before and after the blue fire. And so another question that we have is, how do our estimates compare to a similar site to a similar study in the Sierra Nevada? And so what really inspired us to look into this was this really interesting research project by Atticus Stovall. And we've been looking at the tree mortality data set for other reasons, and the more we looked at it, the more interested we got in considering the methods here, and we wanted to see if we managed to make an improvement or not. And there are pretty different patterns in mortality between the 2 sites. If you look at individual tree mortality aggregated to the 30-meter pixels. And so in this first column is the soap root saddle and lower tea kettle tree mortality plots from our site. And then from the previous study that inspired ours, and then the difference between the 2. And so we wanted to know if we could really believe our results when they're so different from the previous ones. So we took a look at we tried to match each individual tree from our data set to the trees from the previous data set to look at them, but they're offset a little bit because ours uses neon data, which is available in 2017, and the previous study used NAPE data, which is what was available at the time of their research. And so that's in 2016, right at the end of the drought. So there's some differences just because trees could be dead in trees could be alive in 2016 and then later on be dead in 2017 by the time of our study. So this isn't necessarily a contradictory box here. But what we were interested in is these trees that were labeled dead in 2016 that are still labeled as alive in our study. And so we looked at the mean NDVI within the crown perimeters of those trees that were labeled alive in our study. And we were wondering if those were more indicative of dead or alive trees. And when we looked at the trees where both studies agreed, the mean NDVI within those crown perimeters, there is some of those incorrectly labeled trees are probably in this lower tail. And probably a little bit of randomness throughout, but it does seem more consistent with belonging to that, to an underlying distribution of live trees than dead ones. So we feel that at least from this perspective that those trees are probably more likely to be alive as we classified them. And so the key takeaways from this project was that we mapped more than 1 million individual trees and achieved 92% accuracy on our classifications of live or dead trees. The cumulative tree mortality at low elevations was almost half after a drought, and also within an area that may not be able to support regeneration of those trees. And wildfires brought the total mortality up to 82 to 94% within wildfire perimeters after the drought. So for our second aim, we wanted to know to what extent could we predict that an individual tree would die from the information that we have. So in order to investigate that, we did have a couple, some analyses of potential driver variables of tree mortality that we looked at. The previous work by Stovall and others had showed that tree height was the most important predictor, and that's also something that we found. So at Soper's Saddle, there's a pretty strong relationship between tree height and likelihood of mortality, where it increases steeply up until a tree height of about 30 meters, and then the likelihood is just about 70% for these larger trees. Similarly, there's a pretty consistent relationship between the likelihood of mortality for trees and their distance from rivers, which makes sense. If you're further from a river, you probably have less access to water and be more likely to die. A lower tea kettle has some of these relationships, but they look pretty different. So the likelihood of mortality does generally increase with tree height, but to a lesser extent, and it doesn't reach sort of a saturation point. And the relationship with distance to rivers is much smaller. So you can already tell that Soper's Saddle might be easier to predict than lower tea kettle, and that's definitely what we found. So our method was to use our target variable, just a binary 1, 0 if a tree is dead in 2017 and 1 otherwise if it's alive. and we looked at several feature variables, including 6 vegetation traits, 5 topography features, and 6 climate variables. And so just to get a sense, not to read each graph or anything, but just to get a sense of the different variations of these feature variables and how they do, some of them correlate with each other and may not provide a lot of additional information, but some of them are pretty different. These are all just scaled from their lower to upper boundary to get a sense for that. These are the feature variables that we looked at. And for the model setup, similarly to the first part of our study, we did a 60-20-20 split so that you can have 60% training data, a 20% data set to use as validation and tune your parameters, and then 20% held out to the end to evaluate the method. And we used extreme gradient boosting through the XGBoost package in R. It's a decision tree-based method where the model learns from the performance of subsequent sets of trees. So similar to a random forest, but different in that it learns from subsequent sets rather than doing a vote. And so fruit saddle here, just to start with, already has an almost equal number of live and dead trees. Naturally, that's how many trees died by 2017. So in terms of a classification model with 2 classes, it already kind of has balanced classes to avoid overfitting, which I think is kind of interesting. And just something to point out. So we did a grid search of several hyperparameters that you can choose within the XGBoost model, and selected the best hyperparameters that we found from the grid search. And then in this case, we combined the training and validation data set after that process into one big data set that we could use to train the model while still having that 20% partition left out to test at the end to assess the accuracy of the model. And then from there, we created maps so that we could compare. So both the training and test data set, that 80% training data set after tuning the hyperparameters, and then the held out set had an overall accuracy of about 74% on the so-grit saddle. So more errors in these incorrect boxes, but still we were happy to see that the diagonal where it's labeled dead and modeled dead, labeled alive and modeled alive are higher than the other two, because that can be a little tricky. So that worked out fairly well for so-grit saddle, less well for lower tea kettle. There weren't a lot of driver variables that we looked at that had strong relationships with those, and so it's not that easy to predict mortality there. There's more interesting things going on than what can be described by this type of model, but at so-grit saddle, we've got the observations and tree mortality fraction mapped and the estimates from the XGBoost model. And while it's a little bit more representing extreme estimates one way or the other rather than some of the in-betweens, it does pick up a lot of the structure of mortality in that area. And we looked at the correlation of our modeled mortality fraction with the observations, and it is pretty messy. It has an R-squared of 0.43, but they do more or less correlate with each other. And the most important variables that we found from the ones that we looked at are tree height, distance from rivers, and canopy cover fraction. So for tree height, this one, based on the research that I've read, it really seems like this is probably related to bark beetle preference for larger trees under drought conditions. And then distance from rivers. We were kind of wondering when we tested this one if trees further from rivers might just be species that are more adapted to lower water conditions. So we weren't sure if it was going to be as straightforward as you might expect, but it turned out to be the further you are from rivers, the more likely the trees were to die. And then the canopy cover fraction was also an important driver, which we think would affect the micrometeorology environment of the trees and keep them cooler. So aim 2 key takeaways. We predicted individual tree mortality using extreme gradient boosting with an accuracy of 74% at Soap-Root Saddle. I believe it was closer to 60% at lower tea kettle, so not a lot of information gained there. And the most important drivers of tree mortality were tree height, distance from rivers, and canopy cover fraction. So for the last aim, these earlier investigations are over a really small area, I believe 140 square kilometers. And so what we wanted to know is, could we link individual tree mortality to the Landsat time series record so you could get a broader sense of tree mortality. Maybe not extrapolating very far, so you want to be in the same forest that you're training the earlier data set on, but broader than the area that we initially looked at. And so here we have Soap-Root Saddle and lower tea kettle again, but the background is just the negative change in the normalized difference moisture index from taking the difference between the near infrared and shortwave infrared bands, which tells you about moisture in the leaves. Like if we were looking at lakes and you were just looking at NDMI, they really pop out from that water content. So here's the negative change. So we're looking at decreases in water content. And there's pretty widespread decrease in NDMI in this region between 2011 and 2017. And so we have just NDMI on a scale of negative 0.2 to 0.6, ranges from -1 to 1, but this is about the range that you see at Soap-Root Saddle. You can see the progression of drying. The drought ends in 2016, so some of this leftover signal in 2017 may be just from the change in the vegetation, even as some of the areas show a little bit less change in there as the area is recovering from drought. And there's less change overall at lower tea kettle, the higher elevation site that has some snowpack and things like that also contributing to the water content. And so for the methods for this last aim, we downloaded Landsat 5 and 8 scenes. We skipped 7 because of the striping. We just wanted to start with Landsat 5 and 8. So that has a date range from 1984 through September 2017. We included 2017 since that's when our mortality fraction estimates are from, even though the drought ended a year earlier. We filtered the pixels for clouds, cloud shadows, and snow using their QA pixel band. And the time series has a 16-day interval. And so this is just looking at a little snapshot of that data set and then extending a little further just for context and thinking about what might be gained from looking at the time series. So we've got from about 2000 through 2022 or 3 here, from Also, still looking at the normalized difference moisture index on the y-axis. And these are 3 randomly selected pixels within the fire perimeter from the 2020 Creek Fire. So when I looked at these, I kind of expected to see a pretty dramatic drop-off from the Creek Fire. But within the pixels, it's not always that clear of a signal. So these are just randomly selected. The seasonal signal's not necessarily that clear. Some data is missing from snow and cloud cover, things like that. The drought period is here in orange from 2012 to 2016. A bit of data missing because only Landsat 7 covers that time period. And then here's where the Creek Fire is. And sometimes the signal is a bit more clear than other times. And so what we were hoping is to make use of information in the signal to try to link individual tree mortality to the Landsat time series. So what we did is apply a one-dimensional convolutional neural network to that time series, using the Keras library in R, just up to 2017, not the part with the Creek Fire from the previous slide, to try to estimate 2017 tree mortality. So in this case, for our model, what our model's working on is this 3D array with dimensions n by m by k, where n is the number of pixels that we have in the whole area. M is the number of time points, so those 16-day return intervals. And K is the number of channels or bands. So you could look at just one band at a time, or you can provide additional ones to see if that adds any information. And then what we're trying to predict here is the tree mortality fraction from 0 to 1. And if we don't see any trees there, this is a little controversial within my doctoral thesis committee, we set that to 0. So if it sees granite, it'll set it to 0. And then also any missing time points in the time series because of clouds or shadows, those are also set to 0. Since the model can't handle no data information. And then we tested 6 bands by themselves and then all the bands together. And I think in the future I'll drop blue because of atmospheric scattering of the blue has been shown to make this type of prediction more challenging. But the results are for these 6 bands separately and together. We didn't try different combinations of them. And we tracked the performance of the model on the training and validation data set for each training epoch to look for when the performance stops improving on the validation data set because we don't want it to overfit, and found that at about 22 epochs, it starts just kind of moving around while the training performance is improving. So we stopped the model at 22 epochs and we used that version. And we found that we can get a mean absolute error of about 16.5% on the validation data set. So if we're trying to model mortality fraction from 0% to 100%, it's going to be off by about 17% on average. And this is what the maps look like of our observations against the predictions. It's a bit easier problem than trying to do mortality risk from traits because it's a more direct method of trying to see tree mortality in the Landsat time series. And overall, there wasn't too much patterning in the negative difference versus, or the positive difference between the observations and the predictions. So didn't seem to be a lot of spatial bias there. And the correlation seemed relatively good to us for satellite data. Overall, it has an R-squared of 0.44 for all the pixels, and if you look at pixels where there's at least 4 trees, then it's 0.57. And this figure is the correlation where the pixels are filtered for at least having 4 trees. And so we were really wondering, if we apply this model then to a larger area, what does mortality fraction look like beyond those 2 sites? And we're not really sure how far we could extrapolate it, but this is just the figure that's giving us, I guess, some more questions about, is this area of high predicted mortality from this convolutional neural network real or not? That kind of thing, or is there just some other kind of land feature there that we didn't have in our training data set? But the key takeaways are that we applied a one-dimensional convolutional neural network and predicted 2017 tree mortality fraction. Had some error, but overall the spatial appearance seems pretty good, or if we quantify it a bit more, the R-squared for all the pixels was about 0.44. So future directions for that chapter is to extend the time series model to estimate tree mortality fraction for the different years. We don't yet know if it's just hyper-trained to 2017, which it might be. We kind of want to see how flexible it is or how we might go about doing that. And to extend the risk analysis to a broader range. And then I do have some wildfire slides here because I learned that that might be of interest to folks. So I have them if you happen to have questions about them. But I'll skip here to the acknowledgement section for those 3 A's where I had a lot of help in advising on putting those together. And that research is primarily funded by NASA. Thank you very much for your time and listening to the seminar topic.
Time for some questions. I had 2 questions, please. The first one deals with your LiDAR data. Because you said you used a 1 meter buffer around the trees to determine like the mortality threshold. Is that right?
1 meter buffer for the
For the LiDAR, I think I was trying to. I kind of picked it up. I guess maybe I missed exactly how you did it. Like whenever you did the differentiation between a still alive tree in LiDAR, or like when you considered it dead.
For those, for the classification, we actually took the 1 meter buffer. I don't think we used a 1 meter buffer, so I'm wondering where.
I thought I heard 1 meter. Maybe I just was like thinking and trying to figure it out.
Well, here's what we did, and then we see where the question is.
Sure.
Okay, so for each of these polygons, we looked at this 1 meter resolution data.
Oh, 1 meter
resolution.
resolution. Okay.
Where it's coming from.
Oh, maybe that's where it.
And then we looked at those 2 thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
So what we ended up finding is that if at least like 30, I think it was maybe like 37% of the crown fraction was below a specific threshold,
Okay.
we could relatively easily classify that as dead.
Yeah, for the 2, for like the spectral and the LiDAR measure, is that right?
So we use that just for the spectral part, and so an earlier step was to look for any trees. So we tracked their crown perimeters in 2013, and then next year's.
Yeah.
So if we saw that that crown area went from something above 1 square meter, maybe this is
This
where-
is maybe what I
Okay,
yeah,
this
yeah,
is,
sorry.
found it.
Okay.
From above 1 square meter to below,
Yeah.
then we counted it as dead, like as a fallen dead tree.
I understand, okay. That's, I guess, what I was wondering about is like, and maybe I'm wrong thinking about this, but like, wouldn't that bias trees that are larger, that potentially could be standing dead, that have very large branches, to maintaining some of that size, rather than losing, like, you know what I mean? The smaller trees would have much thinner branches, and at neon's points per meter for the LiDAR, it would actually fail to pick up. Like, you'd see a difference whenever you lost needles, versus the larger trees, that the branches would actually maintain a shape of a tree that would, you know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the hope is, so yes, I feel like it might bias it. The hope is that in this case, it kind of has this appearance
Yeah.
where it still has the branches,
Yeah.
but you can see it. And
But you
then-
can kind of see it, though.
So it gets passed on then to the spectral
The spectral.
reflectance
The
classifier.
big classified.
So it depends, you
Yeah.
know, it might bias it though, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering just because, like, I didn't know, I mean, one of the things that would have been great would be to see the distribution of the size of the trees at Soap Fruit versus tea kettle, because then I would understand whether or not they were much smaller trees in one site or the other, if the distribution was pretty even, and that was less of an issue, leading to some of your classification errors across the two sites. So that was one question. The second one will be very, very fast, though. So I don't want to monopolize it. Did you carry out BRDF and topographic corrections of your flight lines for neon?
I did not do them, but Neon does them.
So I don't know that Neon does them, but we do them. But Neon doesn't do them themselves, but they're going to, unless they did them, unless Tristan did it for you. But typically that wouldn't happen. The only reason I ask is because, like, in tea kettle or in soap root, you had very consistent imagery, and in tea kettle you actually saw, like, your maps didn't line up with Atticus's maps very well in certain areas, and I could almost see like a cross-track illumination effect happening. So I just didn't know if it was a BRDF effect. And also, like, the really long lines in those areas versus soap root would translate to more of a problematic issue with the topography and also potential cross-track illumination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, they're, they
like-
don't correct their really high resolution imagery, like the 30 centimeter data, I think it is,
Yeah.
their camera imagery for BRDF effects. If they don't do it, somebody does though for their hyperspectral instrument.
Okay.
So that one, is that, and I asked Tristan at Neon when I visited about it.
Yeah, sure.
And, yeah, Tristan Golden,
Yeah,
who works on that. So their HSI instrument, I believe, is their hyperspectral one. That one does get corrected. So that's why I use the lower resolution 1 meter data, whereas some investigations have used the higher resolution data. Whereas, like, if you're doing more of an image classification, that might still be okay for delineating tree crowns.
Okay.
But yeah, so for that one, it could still be an issue with that, but I actually think that's why some of this might have happened. Because I think, like, in the heart of their investigation, the native imagery might have been the only one available.
Yeah.
And so using best available data,
Sure.
I think that's maybe what happened, but I'm not sure.
Sure, it's really cool.
Might also do some kind of correction, but I had trouble working with it because I initially tried to follow their methods.
It's so interesting. Thank you. It's super
Yeah.
cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Well, I had a question about your aim number 3.
Oh, sure.
So you had this sort of high resolution mortality fraction that got aggregated to 30 million pixels. So now you have a map of the thousands of pixels.
Yeah.
That's your population. Do you seem to take that population and simply divide it into 70 and 30, training and testing?
I believe, how did we do that one? I believe so, where we did like 60%, same thing, we just randomly partitioned it.
But the entire population was partitioned into training and testing.
Yes, well, like 60% training, 20% validation, and 20% testing.
So does that mean that the map that you showed, 60% of that map is actually made
From training data, yeah.
So, I mean, these convolution networks are extremely good at learning patterns, right? So there could be two pixels right next to each other. This is training, this is testing. And then
Yeah.
you're getting great results. I'm wondering if you can do some sort of an observation study where you remove half of the study area and see if the other half works.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. And I mean, so there's that issue, and I'm also wondering if you tried to just train it on even just one site with totally different topography. Like you could just try to train it on this one site and see how it does at the other one, because then it's pretty far away and it also has a different class balance. It's continuous this time from 0 to 1, but it's still, I think it's the type of problem where it should be something you could extrapolate like that for. Like it's not the problem of what's driving the mortality. But I see what you're saying, where you're just giving it like two very similar pixels. And I think it's a little bit better than if it's like 2 Landsat pixels and you're doing another kind of machine learning thing on it, and that's the highest resolution you have, where at least that you have the individual tree mortality data going into the mortality fraction, so those two are independent in a sense, but there's still some spatial autocorrelation there with the distributions. But still, I agree that it's an issue. And I do think that considering if you trained a model here, how does it perform there, might be a way to address that issue, but also kind of consider the limits of how far you could extrapolate it. Yeah, I appreciate that. This one we're still working on, so I can still incorporate like that.
Good. Good question. Steve?
Yep.
Yeah, great talk. I have a question about the train mortality in SOAP and peak. I remember you showed one figure for SOAP, it kind of plateaued in 2017, but it just keep on progressing for peak. Can you, like explain a little bit why that happened?
Yeah, I lost my mouse for a moment.
Yeah, it's like a bar plot.
Where is it?
It's probably after this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I guess my thought process on that is that this SOAP saddle has a lot of ponderosa pines, and it's highly stressed. So my guess is that the bark beetles took all the trees that they wanted by this point, and there weren't really any more specimens that would really attract them.
Okay,
That'd
so
be
what
my
can be
guess.
that already died?
That's what I think. I mean, there is this little bit, but this could also be from being so close to a wildfire. I guess not within the perimeter, but whereas this might be more other types of effects where there's a little bit of like they're stressed and they're trying to recover but not managing to kind of thing. But that would be my guess.
Well, great talk, very interesting. Before I ask my question, I'll just give a caveat that I'm a water person, and when you're a water person, you think that water always matters.
Yeah, and it does.
It's about the mortality predictions. And I was wondering, 9% was described by the proximity to the river. I wonder if you considered other parameters like concavity of the landscape or upstream contributing area as potential, not having an actual river, but indicating where you are in the landscape as a predictor.
We did not consider those things, but I think it would be really cool to look at like local minima in the landscape that would collect water a bit more and be those like little niches of, I think the thought has crossed my mind, and I feel like it's very helpful to talk to water people about these problems, because I'm like, is that even enough? I don't know. But like, I think that's a really important point. And with the upstream water sources, I think that would be especially helpful. We didn't explore it, but I think it'd be especially helpful at Lower Tea Kettle, where there's a consistent snowpack, and you could consider that kind of like a source of water, especially in the summer. That could be really helpful.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, like how much, maybe you just have some intuition about this, about the spatial autocorrelation structure of mortality, right? Because like if one tree dies, the tree next to it could either be happy, right, because it has more resource access, or they could be both under the same pressure, or those bark beetles are jumping because they are physical objects that have to move, right? And so like, can you tease those apart in this model at all? Like to what extent is it, or like can you even put that into the model? Because it seems like some of that might be useful information.
Yeah, no, I think there was, I don't think that it would go into the XG boost model very well, but I do think it'd be cool to consider more of like a network-based model where you could consider those things, or consider like communication between trees, or sources of support from like mycorrhizal networks and things. Like, I'm not sure what all you could consider that way, or like, but no, I think it'd be really cool to look at it that way. And we did have some ideas about trying to apply a disease model to the trees, to think about like their susceptibility to pathogens or things like that, but we did not explore it. But a lot of ideas about it.
All right. All right. Well, we're just at the top of the hour, so I think maybe we should get another hand. Dr. Hemming-Schroeder.